My name is Linda Barrett, and I'm the archivist and acting manager of the Genealogy, Local History, and Archives Unit here at the Fort Worth Library. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. And if you don't have one already, we have brochures in the back on the table by the door that tell you about the rest of the lecture series as well as the film series. Lynn Spalding is doing the film series as well. And we also have the word reading booklets that talk about some events that are going on here in the library. You can pick those up on the same table. And I'd like to welcome Lynn Spalding. She is the assistant archivist at the Tarrant County Archives across the street to the north from us. Lynn?
Thank you. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the popular culture during World War I. As in any time period, the popular culture of the World War I era both reflected and shaped public thought and opinion, making it a useful tool for understanding how Americans felt about the war. The popular culture of the era influenced Americans to get behind the war cause and evoked feelings of patriotism in a time when they were reluctant to get involved. During the 1910s, Americans had more leisure time than ever before and more choices of entertainment. Dance halls, movie houses, vaudeville shows, and amusement parks were commonplace in many of the big cities. Americans were spending more of their time partaking in these activities, causing the popular culture to become heavily influential on their lives. Today we will be looking at three popular forms of entertainment during the war years and how they shaped public opinion of the war, as well as how these forms of popular entertainment were affected by the war. At the same time, these forms of entertainment show us how thoughts and moods changed amongst Americans. We'll be looking specifically at vaudeville, motion pictures, and popular music. I will be using examples of both local and national entertainment since the two are inseparable in many ways. Is my clicker going to work? Maybe not. All right. So during the war years, movies were beginning to eclipse vaudeville in popularity, but vaudeville still remained a highly popular form of entertainment. Vaudeville differed from regular theater in that it featured several acts of what was often referred to as lowbrow entertainment, such as slapstick comedies, burlesque, minstrel shows, and song and dance acts. Vaudeville appealed to and was accessible to the masses, which made it not only successful but influential as well. Vaudeville was top in entertainment in Fort Worth in the years leading up to the war, and there were several venues that housed vaudeville acts. It was so popular in Fort Worth that it was one time credited with steering attention away from Hell's Half Acre during this period. Oh, one back. One back. Did I do that? Okay. So popular venues in Fort Worth included the Majestic Theatre, which you can see on the right. And then the Byers, Greenwalls, or Opera House was another popular entertainment for vaudeville. And moving on. Okay, so the Majestic Theatre, formerly located on Commerce, opened in 1911 at this location after a brief stint in a smaller venue that opened in 1905. It was arguably the most opulent theater in Fort Worth during the time. It was decorated in Renaissance decor with 1,500 seats, a balcony, box seats. The theater also had a nursery, a gentleman's smoking room, a women's parlor, and more. In the early years, the theater was host to in-demand national acts such as the Three Keatons, which featured Buster Keaton when he was a child with his family, Harry Houdini, Al Jolson, Will Rogers, the Marx Brothers, Fred and Adele Astaire, Mae West, and many more. Unfortunately, this theater was torn down to make room for the current Fort Worth Convention Center, so it is gone. And this is just another view. This was inside the theater. This would be where the stage was, this with the drop curtain down. So as you can see, it was very beautiful inside. And then this is just an example of some of the playbills that we have at the Tarrant County Archives. They're online and accessible to look at. And they show that the four Marx Brothers were there, the four Keatons and Buster, and then the last one shows Fred and Adele Astaire. All right, so although not necessarily vaudeville, this is local stuntman and daredevil Ormer Locklear. And he was a popular performer that came out of this era. And he actually has an interesting story connected with the Majestic Theatre, which is why I put him here. So in 1916, his brother went to a show at the Majestic that Harry Houdini was performing at, and arranged for Ormer Locklear and Harry Houdini to meet. So they decided that they would come together and perform a stunt together. And the stunt had Ormer Locklear on a motorcycle. This was before he was doing his aviation stuff, and Harry Houdini tied up behind the motorcycle, and he dragged him down Main Street and to see if Houdini could get free, and he did. So that was kind of helped Locklear get some popularity. It wasn't long before, well, no, that's the wrong thing. Okay, so when the war broke out, Locklear enlisted and became a flight instructor at Barron Field, and it was here that he mastered his skill as a wing walker. He became popular for wing walking and began drawing crowds to his performances, and so he became very popular around here. As you can see, this was a headline from the Star-Telegram, and people were talking about how he was doing crazier stunts than what was even seen overseas on the Western Front. And he went on to have a movie career, but died shortly after in 1920 in a stunt that went wrong. So he only made 2 movies at the time. All right, so it wasn't long before several of the vaudeville theaters in Fort Worth began showing movies and during their regular programming. So at the Majestic Theatre on those previous programs, you saw the Majesticograph, and that was used to show first-run motion pictures and newsreels, and that shows up in the programs as early as 1908. So they were showing films pretty early on in Fort Worth. By 1914, several theaters had opened for the purpose of showing motion pictures, including the Isis Theatre down here. This was the first Isis Theatre. There's now the new Isis Theatre, which sits in the stock show vacant right now. But this was the first version of it. Also, the Queen Theatre up here, and this is the Egyptian over on the right at the top. By 1917, motion pictures were on the path to a promising future as vaudeville continued to slowly lose its draw, but very slowly. It was still very popular. By 1914, local theater bills were showing less traveling vaudeville shows and providing more time for movies. Many of the theaters during this time were set up for live music accompaniment that sometimes went beyond just an organ and consisted of full orchestras. And they also had a lot of live stage acts before and after movies. So it's kind of this transition period of still having live performances and moving into motion pictures. So the appeal of motion pictures grew stronger as movies became more sophisticated. What began as short clips of street scenes, people dancing, firefighters putting out fires, very normal scenes you would see in everyday life, had now grown into full-length feature films with narratives, and a movie star celebrity culture was on the rise, and people were flocking to the movie houses to see their favorite stars. While we tend to remember the slapstick comedies of the silent era, such as those of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, it was actually drama that was flourishing in 1917. According to a lot of contemporary movie fan magazine polling, comedians were not found anywhere in the top 10, which is surprising because we tend to remember them a little bit more. So instead, it was stars such as Mary Pickford, who is known as America's Sweetheart, Frances X. Bushman, and then on the far right is Pearl White, and she was Queen of the Serials, is what a lot of them called her. So you could go see her movies regularly all the time. Popular too during this era was Theda Bara, and she was they called her the Vamp. And she made this popular in a movie called A Fool There Was in 1915. She was often portrayed as a foreign woman that had heavy black makeup and, dressed a little bit differently than America's sweetheart. And so she differed dramatically from the all-American girls such as Blanche Sweet and Mary Pickford and the Gish sisters, which made her intriguing to audiences. So her movie Cleopatra, which on the left is what she is in costume for, was the top box office draw in 1917. It made the most top grossing film. Following it, though, was America's Sweetheart. And she made these two films, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm and The Poor Little Rich Girl, were the second and third top grossing films. So kind of had a contrast there between the types of women that were popular during this time. So it wasn't until about 1918 that comedians started to rise in popularity. Charlie Chaplin had been making short films since around 1913 with a female comedian named Mabel Normand. But it wasn't until around 1918 that his comedy became more popular among audiences. In 1918, he made a propaganda film called Shoulder Arms, and it vilified the Germans, but it was still through slapstick comedy. So it caused a little bit of controversy among some people that we shouldn't be laughing at the war and what's happening. But despite any controversy, Charlie Chaplin was popular among soldiers, and it is said that his movies were played to shreds in overseas movie houses that were behind the front lines, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's really no surprise, though, that comedians were popular during this time. People needed a little bit of comic relief, and these guys provided it. So in addition to Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton on the top right was making a lot of films with Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, and they were very popular as well during this period. And it was them two, they would actually go in California and do a lot of vaudeville acts for the soldiers and put on shows and raise money for the war effort. Okay. 1918 also saw the rise of Douglas Fairbanks, often referred to as the first king of Hollywood, and best known for his swashbuckling roles of the 1920s. However, in 1918, he was still playing dramatic and comedic roles. He hadn't quite got into the costume characters. He was actually a little bit reluctant to do that when it came around. But he was portrayed as the ideal all-American man, and he was very popular among audiences. And his popular status as a movie star also put him even on the bestseller list. I have one of his books out there. He wrote self-help books, which most people say they were written by somebody else. But he put them out, and they made a lot of money for having his name on them. By this point in time, he and Mary Pickford were on the path to marriage. They weren't quite married yet. They wouldn't be until 1920. But were without question the most popular and influential movie couple in Hollywood. And it was a status that remained unrivaled for several years. So before and during the war years, motion pictures had an unmatched ability to sway public thought and opinion, and several propaganda films had a remarkable influence on how Americans felt about the war raging overseas. So before the United States entered the war, audiences were intrigued by war dramas that emphasized the horrors of what was occurring overseas, but they didn't quite, it was happening over there. So it was interesting to them to watch, but they did not want to be affected by it. The general attitude among Americans was that we should not get involved in the war at this time. Instead, they were content with consuming entertainment that kept the war at a safe distance. Once Americans entered the war, the popular culture shifted. Suddenly, it was calling upon American men to fight and American citizens to make sacrifices for the cause. Movies made heroes of soldiers, popular songs were spirited and inspired young men to take up arms, and celebrities headed out on Liberty Bond rallies to raise money. I've chosen a few different propaganda films that came out between 1915 and 1918 to demonstrate how these movies reflected and shifted opinion. So the first one I'm looking at came out in 1915, and this was before the war, and before the war over here. and it was called The Battle Cry of Peace. This movie demonstrated the horrors of war and evoked fear among Americans by portraying an America that has been taken over by the enemy. Images of Americans being killed and a destroyed White House were used as propaganda in this film to ensure that Americans were prepared for the realities of war. Teddy Roosevelt backed this film and publicly supported it to push his vision of peace at any price. The movie is credited for its role in influencing military officials to better prepare for the possibility of war, and for ammunition companies to step up production. When America did enter the war, people realized that some of the scenes were a little over the top, a little dramatic, and they deleted some of those scenes and they put the movie back out as The Battle Cry of War to make it a little more patriotic, or it still was patriotic, but to make it influence Americans a little bit more to take up arms, to less fear. The next film, maybe? Yes. All right, so this film came out in 1916. It's called Civilization, and it was in stark contrast to Battle Cry of Peace. It, too, was a propaganda film, but it was an anti-war film that appealed to pacifists rather than creating an idea of being prepared for the war. The Democratic National Committee credited this film with influencing the re-election of Woodrow Wilson when he still had his isolationist stance. And it's the story of a submarine commander who refuses to fire at an ocean liner carrying ammunition because there's civilians on it. So probably definitely influenced by the Lusitania. And the movie has strong religious undertones or overtones that suggest that war goes against God, and it is one of the earliest portrayals of Jesus on film, which is really interesting. So they tried to use that religious stance to say war is bad, we should not be doing this. And after America declared war, it was pulled from distribution because of this message. Okay, so the next film, in 1917, so we're going through the years, now we're in the war, starred in The Little American, and it was a propaganda film that further pushed the idea of the evil Hun, and very much created, well, it didn't create, but it very much used that image of the evil Hun. And so in this story, America's sweetheart finds herself the victim of a German U-boat attack while aboard a passenger ship, again influenced by the Lusitania. And after the attack, she receives harsh, barbaric treatment from the Germans, including even a rape attempt. So this was horrifying to audiences to see America's sweetheart in this position. And it got a lot of people feeling a lot more patriotic and wanting to contribute to the war effort, and made them view Germans even more negatively than they already were at the time. All right, and then the last propaganda film I'm looking at is D.W. Griffith's Hearts of the World. So this movie is interesting. D.W. Griffith was hired by the British government and to make a film that would change Americans' isolationist stance. So he was given unprecedented access to go over to the front lines and go and film the war firsthand. It was a very dangerous position that he was put in. And so he filmed along the front lines in France and England, and this movie ends up coming out in 1918 and portrayed the enemy as evildoers who basically are psychopathic. So they're seen, just kicking women for no reason and just kind of over the top, making the Germans look as bad as possible. The film actually, since it came out in 1918, a little bit later, it affected American audiences so much that a lot of them even were against talks of armistice because of how it portrayed the Germans. They thought it was just horrifying, and how could that be? So this was a highly influential movie as well. Okay, so I think this is where, so the Liberty Bond, so we have propaganda movies, and those are influencing Americans, making them feel more patriotic, making them, go back one. Making them feel more patriotic, 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 making Okay, hold on. So they also did these Liberty Bond drives. So they used the popular culture as well, just as they did with actual movie making, to run these Liberty Bond drives. They hired artists, famous artists, and then, of course, celebrities to go out and try to raise money with these different ways of raising money. So let's see. The next video I don't think is going to play. So I had 2 videos, but one of them is not going to work. So I will just talk about what it was. So with Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, and Charlie Chaplin as top stars in 1918, as you see them up here, it only made sense that their fame would be used to garner financial support for the war. So the 3 stars, along with several other popular stars of the time, joined the Motion Picture War Service Association and embarked on a nationwide Liberty Bond drive to sell bonds. They went all over to different cities doing these types of rallies down here and getting thousands of people riled up and raising money. They even stopped in Dallas and Waco that I could find proof of. I'm not sure of Fort Worth. I don't think so, but I know Waco and Dallas for sure. And let's see. So the crowds were so large that came out to support them that movie stars often, they'd go through these crowds and they'd end up disheveled and their clothes torn because people wanted souvenirs from them and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, celebrity culture has been going on for a long time. And movie stars also, in addition to Liberty Bonds, they also contributed to the American Red Cross. Some of the female stars of the time, like the Talmadge sisters, actually created nursing classes and supported the National Red Cross in that way. And Mary Pickford was known for setting up an ambulance fund to raise money for more ambulances on the front lines. She was a really good war advocate. She did a lot to raise money. And the Motion Picture Relief Fund was also used to aid soldiers and their families. All right, so now I think we're going to be able to watch this, but we'll have to switch out of this. But let me explain a little bit. So in addition to the Liberty Bond tour, movie stars also made short propaganda films to further promote the sale of Liberty Bonds. If Americans went to movie theaters during this time, they were bombarded with propaganda pieces such as this one, which is, it's called 100% American, and it stars Mary Pickford. And so in this film, it's only about 15 minutes, so I figure we'll watch it. It's really interesting to watch and to see. And so she's tempted to spend money, but she's trying to save it for the Liberty Bond. And it's just a short little comedy-type drama. They did several of these. There's a Charlie Chaplin one called The Bond, which is pretty famous as well. And most of them are in the public domain, so you can watch most of them. But I figure we'll go ahead and watch this one, because it's pretty entertaining to see how they portrayed the Germans and how they used these films to get people to support the war. Hopefully this will work. So those are the types of films they would show in the theaters, with often that ending there that kind of seems a little bit random, with the definite portrayal of the German Hun was very common in these Liberty Bond shorts. So these shorts, along with the rallies, were important pieces of propaganda that helped raise millions of dollars in war bonds. Douglas Fairbanks once boasted that he earned $1,000 from one adoring fan, and Charlie Chaplin topped that figure by raising $20,000 from one woman just that she could sit next to him at a dinner. So they did really well with getting the celebrities involved in those war bond rallies and making those films. So like the movies, vaudeville shows became patriotic as well. Vaudeville acts traveled the country performing exclusively for soldiers and raising money for the cause as well. At times, national vaudeville acts would put on shows for the public with glee clubs and performers from the various military camps. A local example would be a show that was put on at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce by the military in 1918. This show was free to the public, and it included several well-known vaudeville performers in the Camp Bowie Glee Club. So they would often join together, and a lot of these were at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce from what I noticed, and instead of being at the Majestic or at Byers. Another example is a vaudeville show that featured Sergeant Major Carr, a member of the Flying Royal Corps, who was stationed at Hicks Field, and proceeds from the show were donated to a fund for disabled soldiers. Even if officers got in on the act, Colonel Roscoe, commander of Taliaferro Field, was master of ceremonies at a vaudeville show held at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce that honored the Royal Flying Corps. And Colonel Roscoe was introduced by Benny Keith at that show. So there's a lot of big, important Fort Worth people that took part in these shows that raised money for soldiers, and sometimes they entertained just the troops, sometimes the public was involved as well. So, in addition to vaudeville and movies, the popular music of the era was entrenched in the war as well. Songs were patriotic and urged American men to take up arms and join the fight. And many of these songs were also used for song and dance acts in the vaudeville theaters. So they'd put on full-blown patriotic type performances with these songs and stuff. So these are different sheet music, so you can see the different ways they used symbols and were very patriotic. I think we're not going to be able to listen to this one. I had another video with it, just one of the songs that you could hear a sample of the types of music. But you can look up those on YouTube, and pretty much, I think the Library of Congress also has a ton of music digitized from this era. So, because of the music and the dance halls and everything being very popular, Irene and Vernon Castle were arguably the most popular and influential dancing duo to come out of the dance craze of the 1910s. The two quickly rose to stardom for their dance partnering. They invented and popularized dances such as the Castle Walk, that's when they invented, but they popularized the foxtrot and the tango, and lots of various forms of partner dancing. They were also fashion trendsetters. They were authors of books on dancing that were bestsellers. And they even became movie stars. So they were all around very popular during this period. Unfortunately, at the peak of their fame, the war broke out and Vernon Castle enlisted. He was British, so he was in the war before Americans were, because he enlisted overseas. And Irene Castle stayed home and supported the war by starring in patriotic war films, allowing artists to use her image on various war propaganda artwork, and eagerly awaited his return so that they could return to the stage, because they were still very popular, even despite him being out of the limelight. So in 1917, Vernon Castle was stationed at Carruthers Field in Benbrook to train pilots. He had been promoted to captain in the Royal Flying Corps after flying 300 combat missions. And they were often seen around Fort Worth. So this is an example. They performed at the Byers Theater, which is what's here, a performance they did together. And they could often be seen at the Westbrook Hotel dancing, and also at tea dances at the Rivercrest Country Club. So they were all around Fort Worth dancing, and he was training pilots at Benbrook. So on February 15th, 1918, Vernon Castle took a cadet pilot up on a practice flight over Benbrook. And suddenly, another plane being flown by a Royal Flying Corps cadet pilot appeared, and Vernon lost control of the plane he was flying to try to avoid this cadet. Unfortunately, that caused Vernon Castle to crash into the ground, and he was killed instantly. The cadet flying with him and the cadet on the other plane both survived, and also Vernon's beloved pet monkey survived the crash as well. Him and Irene were both big animal people. They had all kinds of animals, not just dogs and cats, but they had monkeys and different kinds of animals that you would normally have as a pet, but they were big animal people, and he brought his monkey Jerry with him to Benbrook, and he was on the flight with him, but survived that. So this was a big thing when he died, and Irene Castle continued to do things, but never quite at the scale she did in the 1910s with him. We'll be showing a movie about them in October that stars Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. That's pretty good, so I suggest you come see that. Okay. So for my last part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about vaudeville and motion pictures on the front lines. So it wasn't only just over here where we had movie theaters and vaudeville shows raising money and putting on shows for different soldiers. We also had stuff going on overseas. The movies and vaudeville were just as popular among soldiers both at home and overseas. So here we have, next one. Okay, so this is a movie theater that was at Camp Bowie. It was called the Liberty Theater. So they had, in addition to this, they had a library and they had a glee club, different things they could do for entertainment. But they did have a movie theater, just, that was important to have. It was also commonplace for movie theaters to be set up behind the front lines. Soldiers set up crude movie houses like this one you see here, and were sent movies from American studios to watch as a distraction. As expected, soldiers were not generally interested in watching dramas or love stories. They preferred comedies, and like I said earlier, reportedly played Charlie Chaplin films to shreds at these different shacks that they set up. They also enjoyed movies that were just basic street scenes and views of home because they missed home, they were homesick, and so just to be able to see the streets of New York or see Chicago or any of those places that were home was comforting to them. So they didn't necessarily care to have dramas and long movies or anything, just stuff that entertained them and generally distracted them from what was happening. The movies were so influential at the front lines that soldiers often use movie terms as a distraction to describe the war. They referred to battles as shows. They named their different dugouts after movie studios. So there was one called the Vitagraph Village. There was another one called the Keystone Cottage. Some of them called trenches picture house tea rooms. They called machine guns cinema cameras. And when they opened fire, they would say they were turning the crank, like filming a movie. This was not all soldiers, but this was something that took place because I think it was a form of distraction, something entertaining for them to think about other than what was really happening. These movie houses eventually became a little more sophisticated, but there's a lot of stories about them being inside there watching movies, and there's bombs and explosions, and they seem like they could care less. They just want to be entrenched in a movie and not have the reality of the war. So Overall, the popular culture of the era served as both a distraction and a way to rouse patriotism in Americans. The vaudeville shows, the motion pictures, and popular music of the era reflected how Americans felt about the war, while also telling them how to feel about the war. So I hope I've shown how that happened in these different, these various forms of popular culture. And thank you guys for listening. And we have about 7 more films, so get one of these brochures and come check out. We're not watching any of these films, but we're watching films about World War I. Our next one is The Fighting 69th with James Cagney. And then we're going to have a musical. We've been watching a lot of war films, and our next one is going to be a Gene Kelly and Judy Garland for Me and My Gal. So after The Fighting 69th. So continue to check out our schedule, and please come see some of our films. Thank you, guys.